Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Imagine looking out your window to see a police-style SUV blocking your driveway, lights flashing. Two officers are writing you $600 in fines for having grass that's half an inch too tall. The only problem? They're fake cops, and I was about to be the one to detain them. For context, I should mention I used to work in loss prevention retail before switching careers into IT, so I was familiar with shopkeepers' privilege and citizens' detention laws in our state. I never thought that knowledge would come in handy in my own driveway, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. My wife and I bought our house about 6 years ago in what seemed like a pretty standard suburban neighborhood. It had an HOA, which we weren't thrilled about, but the fees were reasonable at $45 a month, and for the first few years the HOA was actually pretty hands-off. They maintained the common areas, organized an annual garage sale, and sent out the occasional reminder about holiday decoration guidelines. Nothing too invasive. Then a new family moved onto our street. Nice enough people at first glance. The husband, we'll call him President Pest, seemed particularly interested in community involvement. Within 2 months of moving in, he joined the HOA board. Within 6 months, he'd maneuvered himself into the president position after the previous president retired and moved to Florida. That's when things started getting weird. President Pest's first major initiative was what he called the Community Standards Excellence Program. It started with longer and more detailed violation notices. Someone's trash can visible from the street after 7 p.m., violation notice. A car parked in your driveway facing the wrong direction, violation notice. Kids' chalk drawings on your own driveway, you guessed it, violation notice. But he was just getting warmed up. About 3 months into his tenure as president, we started seeing people in uniforms walking around the neighborhood. At first, I thought maybe the HOA had hired a legitimate security company. The uniforms were navy blue with patches on the shoulders. But when I looked closer at one of them while getting my mail, I noticed the patch said HOA Community Standards Enforcement with a badge-shaped emblem underneath. The person wearing it had what looked like a duty belt with a radio, flashlight, and pepper spray. I mentioned it to my wife that evening. "Did you see those people in uniforms walking around?" She nodded. "Got a flyer about it yesterday. President Pest created an HOA police force to better enforce community standards. He's calling them community standards officers." I pulled up the flyer on our HOA's website. Sure enough, there was a whole announcement about how the board had approved funding for a professional enforcement team to ensure compliance with community standards. The flyer showed photos of the uniforms and mentioned that these officers would be patrolling the neighborhood, documenting violations, and issuing citations. "Can they even do that?" I asked. My wife shrugged. "I mean, it's weird, but I guess if the board approved it, they're not claiming to be actual police, just HOA enforcement. Here's the thing, though. They kind of were claiming to be actual police, or at least strongly implying it. The badges they wore said police across the top in large letters, with community standards in smaller text underneath. Their vehicles, which started appearing a week later, were white SUVs with red and blue LED lights mounted on top. The lights would flash while they were parked, presumably to make them more noticeable. On the side of each SUV, someone had applied vinyl lettering that read HOA Patrol in big block letters with Community Standards Enforcement in smaller text underneath. The whole setup was clearly designed to mimic police vehicles, and I suspected that was exactly the point. The uniforms, the badges, the vehicles, it all felt like a deliberate attempt to give these people an air of authority they didn't actually have. And it was working. I saw neighbors immediately comply when these officers approached them, not questioning whether they had any real authority. I decided to do some research. I pulled up our HOA's bylaws and read through them carefully. Nowhere in the bylaws was there any provision for creating an enforcement team, let alone one that could issue fines. The bylaws mentioned that the board could hire contractors for maintenance and administrative tasks, but that was it. Any fines or penalties had to go through a formal process, written notice of violation, opportunity to contest before the board, and then a fine if the violation wasn't corrected. These community standards officers were bypassing all of that. I also looked into state law regarding impersonating peace officers. Our state had pretty clear statutes. It's illegal to wear a badge, uniform, or use equipment that could lead someone to believe you're a law enforcement officer if you're not actually one. The law specifically mentioned that wearing a badge with the word police on it while conducting enforcement activities constituted impersonation of a peace officer. The red and blue lights were also restricted to authorized emergency vehicles only. I brought all this up at the next HOA board meeting. There were maybe a dozen homeowners there, plus President Pest and the other board members. I raised my hand during the open comment period. I have some concerns about the community standards officers, I said. Specifically, I'm concerned that their uniforms and vehicles might violate state law regarding impersonation of peace officers. President Pest smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for your concern, but I assure you everything has been vetted by legal counsel. What legal counsel? I asked. Can you share that opinion with the community? His smile tightened. That's confidential attorney-client communication. The HOA is the client, and we're all part of the HOA, I pointed out. I don't think you can claim privilege on behalf of all of us without our consent, another board member jumped in. We don't have time to debate legal minutia. The program is already approved and operational. If you have formal concerns, you can submit them in writing. I did submit them in writing, a detailed 3-page letter outlining my concerns about the legality of the program, the lack of authorization in the bylaws, and the potential liability the HOA was taking on. I cited specific state statutes and even included printouts of the relevant laws. President Pest's response came 2 weeks later. Your concerns have been noted. The board stands by its decision. The Community Standards Excellence Program will continue as planned. That was frustrating, but I figured eventually someone would challenge it legally or the board would realize the liability risk and shut it down. I decided to just keep my head down, follow the actual rules in the bylaws, and avoid giving them any legitimate reason to target me. That strategy worked for about 2 months. I was working from home on a Tuesday afternoon when I heard a vehicle pull into my driveway. I looked out my home office window and saw one of the white HOA patrol SUVs parked sideways, completely blocking my driveway. The red and blue lights on top were flashing. I went outside to see what was going on. 2 men in the navy blue uniforms were standing in my driveway, one taking photos of my house with a tablet, the other writing something on a clipboard. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. The one with the clipboard looked up. I recognized him from around the neighborhood, though I didn't know his name. His badge had police across the top and community standards below it. The badge even had a number on it, 147. "We're conducting a compliance inspection," he said. "We've identified multiple violations." "What violations?" He consulted his clipboard. "Your lawn exceeds the maximum permitted height of 3 inches. Your garbage can is visible from the street outside of designated collection hours, and your mailbox post needs repainting." I looked at my lawn. I'd mowed it 4 days ago, and it was maybe 3.5 inches tall. My garbage can was in my garage with the door open because I'd been working on organizing things in there. And my mailbox post had a tiny spot where the paint had chipped, maybe an inch across. "These are absurdly minor issues," I said, "and I don't recall receiving any warning notice about any of them." "The new policy doesn't require warning notices," the second guy chimed in. He was younger, maybe mid-20s, and seemed nervous. "We can issue direct citations for violations." "That's not in the bylaws," I said. "The board has emergency powers to maintain community standards," the first guy said. He pulled out what looked like a ticket book, the kind you can order online from office supply stores, and started writing. "Each violation carries a $200 fine payable within 14 days. The citations were printed on official-looking forms that mimicked traffic tickets, complete with a seal and case numbers. At the bottom, in small print, it said these were civil citations enforceable under municipal code, which was complete nonsense since HOAs aren't municipalities and have no connection to municipal code. I watched him write out 3 separate citations. He tore them from the book with a flourish and handed them to me. "This is your copy. The original goes to the HOA office for processing. You can pay online or by mail." I looked at the citations. They had my name, address, and today's date. Each one listed a violation and a $200 fine, $600 total for completely minor issues, 2 of which were barely even valid. "I'm not paying these," I said calmly. "These aren't legitimate fines. You don't have the authority to issue citations, and the HOA can't impose fines without following the process in the bylaws." The first guy's expression hardened. "Failure to pay will result in additional penalties and could lead to a lien on your property." That's when I made my decision. These guys weren't just overzealous HOA volunteers. They were deliberately impersonating law enforcement officers, using fake badges and police-style vehicles to intimidate residents into paying illegitimate fines, and I was pretty sure what they were doing was a crime. "I need to make a phone call," I said. I pulled out my phone and started recording video. Actually, before I do that, can you state your names and show me your credentials? The first guy immediately held up his hand. You can't record us without consent. Actually, I can, I said. We're on my property and this is a one-party consent state. I'm the one party consenting. Now please identify yourselves. They looked at each other uncertainly. The second guy said, "We don't have to tell you anything. We're done here anyway." He started walking toward the SUV. I stepped into his path, not touching him but making it clear he'd have to go around me. "You're not going anywhere," I said. I kept recording. "I'm calling the police to report impersonation of law enforcement officers. You can either wait here for them to arrive or you can leave and I'll give them this video along with your vehicle's license plate number. Your choice, but leaving is going to look a lot worse for you." The first guy's face went red. "You can't detain us, that's illegal." Actually, under state law, a private citizen can detain someone they have reasonable belief has committed a crime until law enforcement arrives, I said. This was the training from my loss prevention days kicking in. "I have reasonable belief that you're violating state statutes regarding impersonation of peace officers. The badges you're wearing say police on them. Your vehicle has red and blue emergency lights. You're claiming authority to issue citations and collect fines. All of that constitutes impersonation." The second guy looked genuinely scared now. "We're just doing what President Pest told us to do. We didn't know it was illegal." "Then you should probably explain that to the actual police," I said. I dialed 911, keeping my phone's camera pointed at them. The dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency?" "I need police to respond to my address," I said. I gave her my street and house number. "There are 2 individuals here impersonating law enforcement officers. They're wearing badges that say police, driving a vehicle with red and blue emergency lights, and attempting to issue citations. They're still on my property." The dispatcher asked me a few more questions. Were they armed? Were they threatening me? Were they trying to leave? I answered as calmly as I could. She told me officers were on the way and to stay on the line. The 2 fake officers stood there looking increasingly uncomfortable. The younger one kept glancing at his companion, who was staring daggers at me but not moving. "This is harassment," the first guy said. "We're going to file a complaint with the HOA board." "Feel free," I said. "I'll be filing criminal complaints, so I think mine takes priority." We stood there in awkward silence for about 10 minutes. My neighbors started coming out of their houses, curious about the flashing lights and the confrontation in my driveway. One of them, an older gentleman named Bill, who lived 3 doors down, walked over. "Everything okay here?" he asked. "These guys tried to give me $600 in fake HOA fines," I said. "I called the police." Bill's eyebrows went up. He looked at the 2 men in uniform. "You're those HOA enforcement people?" They didn't answer. "They gave me a ticket last week for having my sprinklers on during the day," Bill said. "Cost me $200. I paid it because I figured the HOA could put a lien on my house if I didn't." "The HOA can't actually do that without going through a formal process," I told him. "These fines aren't legitimate. You should dispute it and get your money back." 2 police cruisers pulled up then, one parking on the street and one pulling into my driveway behind the HOA SUV, blocking it in. 4 officers got out. One of them, a sergeant based on the stripes on his uniform, approached us. "Who called?" he asked. "I did," I said. I held up my phone. "I have the whole interaction on video if you need it." The sergeant nodded. He looked at the 2 men in the fake uniforms. "Are you 2 claiming to be law enforcement officers?" The first guy started to say something, but the sergeant held up a hand. "Before you answer, I should let you know that impersonating a peace officer is a crime in this state. I need to see identification from both of you." They pulled out their wallets and handed over driver's licenses. The sergeant examined them and passed them to another officer, who went back to his cruiser, presumably to run their names. "Tell me what's going on here," the sergeant said to me. I explained the whole situation. The HOA creating a fake police force, the uniforms with badges that said police, the vehicles with red and blue lights, the attempted citations for illegitimate fines. I showed him the 3 citations I'd been given. I also pulled up the HOA's website on my phone and showed him the announcement about the Community Standards Excellence Program, complete with photos of the uniforms and vehicles. The sergeant's expression grew more serious as I talked. He looked at the 2 fake officers. "Did you represent yourselves as law enforcement officers with the authority to issue lawful citations?" The younger one immediately said, "No, we told people we were HOA enforcement. We never said we were police." "But you're wearing badges that say police," the sergeant pointed out. It says community standards underneath, the first guy said. He was trying to sound confident, but failing. We were clear about who we represented. The sergeant walked over to their SUV. He examined the red and blue lights mounted on top. These are illegal on civilian vehicles, he said. Red and blue emergency lights are restricted to authorized emergency vehicles only. He pointed at the vinyl lettering on the side. And this whole setup is clearly designed to mimic law enforcement vehicles. The officer who'd gone to run their names came back. Both clean, no warrants. But dispatch says they've gotten 3 other complaints this month about people in these uniforms claiming to be HOA enforcement and issuing citations. The sergeant turned back to the 2 men. Here's what's going to happen. You're both being arrested for impersonating peace officers. You have the right to remain silent. He continued with the Miranda warning while another officer handcuffed them. They were placed in the back of the 2 cruisers. The sergeant told me he'd need my statement and the video I'd recorded. I sent him the video file and gave a detailed statement right there in my driveway. Bill, who'd been watching all of this, was shaking his head. I can't believe President Pest thought he could get away with this. Someone should probably let the other homeowners know, I said. If people have paid these fake fines, they should get their money back. The sergeant overhead. That'll be part of the investigation. We'll need to know how much money was collected and where it went. This could be fraud on top of the impersonation charges. After the police left with the 2 fake officers, I went back inside and called my wife to tell her what had happened. She was shocked, but not entirely surprised. I knew that whole thing was sketchy, she said. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said, but I think we're about to have some serious HOA drama. That was an understatement. Word spread through the neighborhood fast. By that evening, there was a crowd of about 30 people gathered in the common area near the mailboxes, all talking about what had happened. Someone had created an emergency Facebook group for the neighborhood to discuss the situation. People started posting photos of the citations they'd received and comparing notes on how much they'd paid. Someone calculated that President Pest had attempted to collect over $45,000 in fake fines from the neighborhood, with about $4,000 actually paid by families who didn't know they could refuse or were afraid of having liens placed on their properties. The next day, I got an email from President Pest himself. It was a long, rambling message about how I had undermined community security and interfered with lawful HOA operations. He claimed that the community standards officers were completely legal and that I would face consequences for my actions. He demanded that I pay the $600 in fines plus an additional $500 for obstruction of HOA enforcement activities. This strategy was undermined somewhat by the fact that he was still dealing with the legal fallout and had been forced to post a $50,000 bond, which had depleted his savings. Apparently, the police had gone to his house after arresting the 2 fake officers and arrested him as well for organizing the scheme. He was charged with multiple counts of conspiracy to impersonate peace officers and fraud. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The room was packed. Probably 80% of the homeowners showed up, which was unprecedented. President Pest wasn't there, obviously. The other board members tried to maintain order, but people were angry. One homeowner stood up. Did any of you know what President Pest was doing? The board members looked uncomfortable. One of them, the treasurer, said, "He told us he was hiring a security company. He handled all the details himself. We didn't know about the uniforms or the fake badges until later, and by then the program was already running." "Why didn't you stop it when you found out?" someone else demanded. "We tried to raise concerns, but he said it was all legal and that he'd consulted with an attorney," another board member said. She looked genuinely upset. "I voted against continuing the program last month, but I was outvoted." The meeting devolved into chaos for a while, but eventually some decisions were made. President Pest was removed from the board by a vote of the homeowners. The other board members who had supported the fake police program either resigned or were voted out. New board members were elected on the spot. The first act of the new board was to formally dissolve the Community Standards Excellence Program and void all citations that had been issued under it. They also agreed to refund anyone who had paid the fake fines and to hire an actual attorney to review the HOA's bylaws and procedures to make sure nothing like this could happen again. About 14 months after the initial incident, the case finally went to trial. President Pest had rejected multiple plea offers, convinced he would be acquitted. The trial was short and not sweet for him. The prosecution presented the uniforms, the badges, the vehicles with illegal emergency lights, testimonies from the fake officers he'd recruited, and my video. The fake officers had taken plea deals and testified that President Pest had specifically told them to dress and act like police officers to intimidate residents into compliance. President Pest's defense was that the HOA bylaws granted the board authority to enforce standards, and that he had merely hired security personnel to assist with compliance, which was completely legal. His attorney tried to argue that the badges didn't say police exclusively, and that the uniforms were just a way to make the security personnel identifiable. The jury didn't buy it. President Pest was convicted on 3 counts of impersonating a peace officer and 2 counts of fraud. Because he had organized the scheme, recruited others, and collected money under false pretenses, the judge sentenced him to 18 months in county jail, though he would likely serve less with good behavior. He was also ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners who had paid the fake fines. The whole situation fundamentally changed our HOA. The new board implemented strict oversight procedures, required board meetings to follow proper parliamentary procedure, and made all financial records available to homeowners on request. The monthly fees actually went down because we cut out all the unnecessary enforcement expenses. I still have the 3 fake citations framed in my home office. They're a reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with petty tyrants is to let them overreach until they break actual laws. Then watch as the real authorities step in. My neighbors still joke about the day I detained the fake police. Bill calls me sheriff whenever he sees me. I don't mind. It's better than paying $600 for having slightly tall grass. The funny thing is, President Pest's whole goal was to create a more orderly, compliant neighborhood. Instead, he created a neighborhood that now scrutinizes every HOA decision, questions any hint of overreach, and knows exactly what their rights are. We're all a lot more informed about HOA law now, and the board knows they can't get away with anything shady. I'd call that a win. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I was replying to another post when I realized I had a malicious compliance story of my own that deserved to be shared here. Quite some time ago, I worked at an information technology help desk for a large hospital. We were expected to be at our desks, fully logged in, and ready to take our first call by the exact start time of our shifts. The problem was that it took about 10 to 15 minutes to log into the computer, load everything, and sign into 7 different programs, all of which had different passwords. Realistically, that meant we needed to arrive at least 15 minutes early. The computers were shared. Sometimes you could get away with simply locking the computer and leaving all the programs open until your next shift, but if someone restarted the computer before then, you had to log into everything all over again. This was a constant source of frustration for the team, and we raised the issue frequently. Medical staff, for example, were allowed to scrub in and out during their paid shift time, yet we were apparently expected to complete our own required preparation before our shifts began. Eventually, our manager sent the team a somewhat passive-aggressive email. Hi everyone, it seems we are still having a lot of issues regarding shift times, so I want to clarify my expectations. If you are working a 7 o'clock a.m. to 4 o'clock p.m. shift, I expect you to be here, logged in, ready to work, and marked as either available or on a call in the phone queue by 6:59 a.m. If you want to make coffee, fill your water bottle, or put your lunch in the refrigerator, all of that must be done before 7 o'clock a.m., not afterward. At the end of the shift, I expect you to remain marked as either available or on a call until 4:01 p.m. Only then may you log out, wash your coffee cup, and so on. If you are going to be delayed by traffic, trouble finding parking, or a missed bus, you will need to manage your time better and leave earlier. Thanks. So I complied. For a while, I made sure I was marked as either available or on a call exactly 1 second before my shift began. I was simply waiting for the right opportunity. Eventually, it happened. A call came through with slightly less than 2 minutes remaining in my shift, and I answered it. I got as far as confirming the caller's name and location. They were halfway through describing their issue when I saw the clock reach 1 second past the end of my shift. I said, "Sorry to interrupt, but my shift is over. Goodbye." Then I hung up, logged off, and went home. Naturally, the caller complained. My manager pulled me into his office and asked me to explain why I had done that. I said, I was marked as available until about 2 minutes before the end of my shift. Then I answered the call, which changed my status to on a call. I remained on that call until 1 second after my shift ended, so I logged off. My manager replied, "No. If you are on a call, you need to finish the call first." I responded, Your email says we are expected to be marked as either available or on a call 1 second before our shifts begin, which I have been doing. It also says we are expected to remain marked as either available or on a call until 1 second after our shifts end, and that only then may we log off. I was simply following your expectations and written instructions. Of course, this was a major career-limiting move. But by that point, I already had one foot out the door. The next one is an entitled people story. You know how, as adults, we seem to have less and less time for one another? Eventually, you end up with social media friends who are really more like acquaintances from your past. People you speak to once in a million years. Well, the other night, one of those old acquaintances reached out to me. They said they wanted to donate supplies to an organization where I volunteered and was heavily involved. Naturally, because I try to be helpful, I said, "Absolutely, thank you." I told them where they could make the donation and gave them the organization's opening hours. Then they told me they did not have a car, so I would need to come and collect the supplies myself. They lived all the way across town from me, about a 30-minute drive each way. It was not exactly a short trip. However, I was already going in that direction because I had family members I needed to care for, so I agreed. I said, "Sure, how about I do a porch pickup? That way I can collect the donation and continue with the rest of my day." I thought it would be easy. It was not. They kept insisting that I come inside and meet them face to face, which I found strange because I had never offered to socialize with them. At the time, I was brutally overworked. I had family members who depended completely on me, and I was working around 65 hours a week. I gently and politely explained that to this acquaintance several times, but they kept becoming pushier. They completely ignored what I was saying and continued demanding an in-person visit. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, they mentioned their living situation. I thought that was strange. Why were they suddenly telling me that they had to move the following month? Since they would not respect my boundary, I put my phone down and continued with my day. I did not have time to argue with someone. I had errands to run and people to take care of. About 8 hours later, I texted them again. "Hey, I can come and pick up the supplies, but I really cannot come inside and socialize. I have a cranky little one with me who needs to be put to bed." That was completely true. The acquaintance suddenly became furious and said, "Fine. We will dump the supplies outside our building." Then they told me they had made plans to go to a bar and were disappointed that I would not be joining them. Where did that come from? I do not even drink. Anyway, I went to collect the supplies. It was completely dark outside, and I had no idea where I was going because I was unfamiliar with the neighborhood. Eventually, I found the supplies, picked them up, and drove home. After a long day of being an adult with far too many responsibilities, I was ready to go to bed. Then I received another text later that night. I assumed the acquaintance was drunk because they began shaming me for refusing to meet with them. That was when I realized they had probably had an ulterior motive the entire time. They had been so desperate to get me inside because they wanted to ask whether they could move into my home. I had purchased a house by myself about 2 years earlier, so I had a stable place to live. Meanwhile, these acquaintances had been financially unstable and seemed to move every 6 months to a year. I did not pry into their lives. They usually posted everything publicly on social media, so I had a general idea of what was happening. Now I was sitting at home receiving a series of barely coherent drunken messages about how ashamed I should be for not spending time with them. They said they had nowhere to go the following month. They could not afford the rent at the place where they had planned to move. They were running out of money and putting everything on credit cards. It seemed obvious that they were trying to guilt me into letting them stay with me. Honestly, I had already felt that something was wrong when they repeatedly insisted that I come inside their home. It gave me the same kind of uneasy feeling as a stranger trying to lure someone into a vehicle. Something about it felt deeply off, but never in a million years had I expected a request like this. "Hey, acquaintance from years ago, I am going to make my financial problems and housing situation your responsibility, even though I am a grown adult." I did not respond to a single message, and I had no intention of doing so. Silence seemed like the best response. Maybe they would wake up, read the awful things they had sent me, and reflect on their behavior. Then again, they seemed incredibly entitled, so perhaps they would not. Either way, I no longer cared. I did not feel guilty for 1 second about refusing to visit them. In fact, I was proud of myself for trusting my instincts and recognizing that something was wrong. Despite all the driving, gas, time, and effort I spent collecting supplies for the organization, I did not receive a single thank you. Instead, I received drunken insults. Apparently, I was a terrible person, although they used much harsher language, because I did not want to take in people I barely knew. Honestly, I could see why their housing arrangements never lasted very long. Who would want to live with people who behaved like that? They would probably be an absolute nightmare as roommates. I also could not understand why they thought it was my responsibility to take care of them. They seemed to have made quite a few assumptions about my life and my home. What they did not know was that I had bought a very small place. It was barely large enough for me. It was essentially a tiny house. There was no realistic way to fit multiple additional people inside, especially with all the pets this acquaintance owned. Between all of us and my 2 cats, we probably would have violated the fire code. Even if I had wanted to help them, I could not have done it. I know this post is ridiculously long, especially for Reddit, where many people probably will not read the entire thing. But I needed to get these thoughts out of my head. Writing helps me process confusing situations so I do not drive myself crazy trying to understand them. My brain tends to dwell on problems and search for ways to fix them, but there was nothing I could do to fix this situation. That day was another reminder of how often people seem to view me as a tool or a resource. I am expected to pour from an already empty cup and continue giving, giving, and giving. My feelings do not seem to matter. People only seem interested in what they can take from me. Sometimes, I feel like I will always be an outsider looking into a world where I never truly belonged. Please do not argue with me about that. I have lived with this feeling for more than 30 years. I am an autistic adult who functions independently, but navigating other people can still be exhausting. I cannot force the world to recognize me as a person. Sometimes the world is simply as cold and brutal as it chooses to be. That is the end of my long thought process. If you took the time to read all of this, I sincerely thank you. I hope your day is going better than mine was. By the end of that night, I felt completely detached. My only reaction was, okay then. I do not know what will happen to that acquaintance, but I certainly will not be allowing them back into my life anytime soon. Anyway, thank you for watching.